What you do is who you really are. I'm not saying that the decisions you make reflect who you really are. I'm not even saying that they define who you are. I'm saying in the most direct and blunt sense possible, you are what you do. If you have some sensitivity to this fact, this underlying tragedy of our lives as human beings on earth, I think you start to live a very gathered, very focused, very disciplined lifestyle. Whether you think of yourself as sex positive or sex negative, whether you think of yourself as asexual or polyamorous or put yourself in any other category, the consciousness that what you're doing is who you're becoming. It makes you profoundly concerned about the consequences of your actions in the formation of your own character and similar parallel consequences for other people that are in your life. You know, a woman once tried to have sex with me in a train station. And I turned her down. Spoilers, I didn't say it. She was a tall, slim, good-looking woman, pretty face, and I was in the train station to use the public showers, and this was made all the more obvious because she had two friends with her who were like egging her. Oh yeah, you should go for it. You should, you should go offer to get into that guy's shower stall with him, kind of thing. It's a somewhat bizarre situation. If I had slept with that woman, if I'd chosen to sleep with her, that tells you something about the kind of man I am. And the fact that I refused tells you something about the kind of man I am also. Not necessarily as simple as good or bad, right or wrong. It's not as if such an affair would mark me as evil for the rest of my life. But what would it say about me? What would it say about me as a man if I were willing to have sex with someone when I don't even know their name? When I know nothing about them? There might be guys in the audience who say, oh, well, yeah, but come on, she was good looking and it was convenient. It wasn't a lot of work for you to go to her. Okay, even if you add in that explanation, then what does it say about you that you're willing to sleep with somebody when it's convenient? When you just add that, all the other factors being the same. So, I don't know if she's vegetarian or vegan, presumably not, probably a meat eater. I don't know if she smokes cigarettes. I don't know anything about what kind of person she is. And you're suggesting to me that it's cool just because it's convenient. There are consequences to those actions. I'm not even going to say it changes who you are. It is who you are. There's nothing else. Okay, I'm not going to say it reflects who you are. It is who you are. There's nothing else. You're that guy who had sex with that random stranger in a train station when the opportunity presented itself. I knew a guy as a fully grown man, but back when he was a teenager, he had lost his virginity with a prostitute. He paid to fly to the Philippines, and he slept with a prostitute in the Philippines. He was a white guy sleeping with an Asian prostitute when he was a teenager. That was how he lost his virginity. I think it changed who he was forever. And when I knew him, so this is many, many years later, he's a fully grown man, he came up to meet me taking the train. This is the train that went from Bangkok to just outside of the capital city of Laos. The train didn't go all the way in those days. And when he met me on that trip, he was all hopped up. He was all... he was on this weird ego trip. He was all excited because there was a woman on the train who was trying to sleep with him. There was a woman on the train who was saying to him, in effect, through a language barrier, why doesn't he get off a train stop earlier and go and have sex there? And based on the way he told the story, I just asked him, I said, look, sorry, I'm noticing some of the details of the story. Are you sure this woman wasn't a prostitute just trying to turn trade. And he immediately said, oh, yes, she was. He just omitted this information of the story. That, yeah, this was a woman who was trying to make money by getting him to get off the plane a stop early. I hope she wasn't also trying to rob him and take his suitcase or something. But assuming she was an honest broker, that yes, this was just a prostitute. And I looked at this guy. It just blows my mind. And he was like really on an ego trip. Like he felt like he was handsome or charming or special because this woman was trying to have sex with him. And I mean, that's her job. That's how she earns a living, right? Like if I'm walking down the street and there's a car salesman who tries to sell me a car, I happen to walk past one of those places and a guy says, hey, do you want to take a look? We have special discount. I don't feel smart or special. Like I don't think it's not because I'm charming or handsome that this guy's offering to sell me a car. That's his business. He'd sell a car to anyone who was willing to pay, or he'd describe the advantages of these different cars to anyone who's willing to listen. This woman on a train tried to sleep with you, this guy, and you're on an ego trip about that. But again, that was a man who literally lost his virginity with a prostitute in Asia. Of course, there are also questions here, by the way. So the prostitute he lost his virginity with, we don't know. Maybe she slept with 40 people that month. Maybe she slept with 100 people that month. It probably didn't mean much to her when she took his virginity. Probably, we don't know. It's a speculation. It's not easy to say that one more or one fewer client for that woman that month changed her life one way or the other. But of course, in most of our interactions, romantic, sexual, personal, and otherwise, there were at least two parties involved who are going to be affected, who are going to be shaped by the consequences of the decisions we make for the rest of our lives. But in that case, in terms of that guy's psychology, yeah, I do think his decision to sleep with, he decided to start sleeping with prostitutes in Asia as a teenager, and I think it really, that's who he was. I can't say it changed who he was, because even if I say that presumes there was a different person there before, or maybe there's something remaining in him that wasn't changed. No, that's it. That's who you are, dude. Face up to it. You know what? A lot of people have said this, sometimes in insulting me, like, when I was living in these places, when I was living in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, that I was surrounded by, prostitution and these cultures. Okay. When I lived in Thailand, I was surrounded by Buddhist monasteries. I spent my time going to visit Buddhist monasteries. When I lived in Thailand, I was surrounded by museums. I was surrounded by manuscriptoria, which is a fancy word basically meaning an archive, like a specialized library. I spent my time, a lot of these places, the minute I got off the bus or the minute I got out of the airport, I took flights within Thailand sometimes, the minute I got out of the train station, I was going to the archives. I was going to the museums. I was going to Buddhist monasteries and sometimes archaeological sites, ruins of old Buddhist monasteries. I was looking at stone inscriptions, seeing how the words were formed and, the history of the language, the history of the religion, the history of politics. Okay, I was surrounded by all of that stuff, and that was what I chose to do with my time, because that is who I am. That's who I was then in my 20s, and this is who I am now in my 40s. And some other guy, some sex tourist, or even this guy I mentioned who started sleeping with prostitutes when he was 15, he would go to those same places, and what he would see and what he'd be interested in and what he would be responding to are the whores, right? That's what he might be doing. That I don't even know. I don't even know what percentage that is. 90% of people. And sure, it happened to me. I would talk to other tourists, talk to other white people, some European, some American, whatever. And they'd mention that they were going through a particular town or city or something. And I'd say to them, there's a really great museum there, or there's a great, I'd mention some historical site, there's an archaeological site. And they would have no idea. So they'd say, oh, wow, I've been to that town 5 times. I had no idea there was a museum there. I had no idea there was an archaeological site there. There was one guy I talked to him in his office. Not worth describing why, but the office, let's say it was on the 8th floor or something. It was up fairly high. And I was looking out his window, and I said, oh, yeah, I can almost see that 11th century archaeological site from here. I was just there yesterday to go and see them. The first thing I did when I got to that town was go and see them. And this guy was blown away. He said, "What? Just down the road? There's an ancient archaeological site." I said, "Yeah, I rode my bicycle there the other day. That's what I care about." This guy had lived there for years. He'd had an office there for years. You couldn't actually see it from his window, but I was just checking. Oh yeah, it's just a little bit further down that way. He had no interest. Okay, so and yeah, let's be fair to Southeast Asia. It's kind of cheap to say, oh, if you live in Bangkok, Thailand, you're surrounded by prostitution. If you live in Paris, France, if you live in New York City, if you live in Los Angeles, you're surrounded by prostitution too. Okay, that just may not be culturally the main thing you associate with it. Okay, so like in terms of 21st century culture, there are some ways in which people may perceive me as being tremendously sex positive. And there's some ways in which people might perceive me as being very conservative or very sex negative. But I think that's because both of these categories do not really apply to how I see the world. Okay? This guy Onision comes on the internet. He invites a 16-year-old girl into his house to work as his babysitter. Later, when she's 18 years old, he starts having sex with her. He cheats on his wife with her. Horrible situation. Oh, and let's not forget, even though she was over 18, he was the man who took her virginity. He was the first person she'd ever had sex with. Okay? Big long-term consequences for her for the rest of her life she has to live with. Big long-term consequences for him for the rest of his life that he has to live with. But the most fundamental one of all is he has to face up to, dude, this is who you really are. Now, in Onision's case, we know this was not an isolated event. It's not something that just happened once, right? But let's be clear. If you would sleep with a prostitute just once, that's who you really are. If you would sleep with a complete random stranger in a train station when it was convenient under these circumstances, that's who you really are. Yeah, there may be details like that, like, oh, well, or some people do some shit like this, like, it's like, oh, well, but I had just broken up with my boyfriend and my girlfriend. Well, that's also who you really are. You're someone who, when you were unhappy and feeling low self-esteem because you just broken up with your girlfriend or boyfriend, then you would, this is all bundled into who you really are. In Onision's case, it's not just once. He's been through roughly similar situations with several very young women whom he brought into his house and tried to employ as babysitters and got sexually involved with. This same kind of scenario played out also with Billy, and he apparently tried to set up this same scenario, love triangle scenario, because he's married at the same time, again and again and again. So yes, it is also a proven pattern in this case. But what he has to live with is that's who he really is. Anyone who would judge this less harshly than I do, I'd ask you to think about how you'd view it if the genders were reversed, right? Anyone who hears my stupid anecdote about that woman who tried to have sex with me in a train station. And by the way, the shower stall, it was big enough for a three-way. It was big enough for a four-way sex. It was a big private shower stall with good thick concrete walls, by the way. Well, actually, it wasn't. It was private enough. It wasn't a totally ridiculous situation for someone to be trying to initiate sex. Okay? Anyone who says, oh, well, that would be no big deal for a dude to happen to meet and hook up with a complete stranger at a train station. What if I was the female? What if you were talking about me being a woman who's willing to do that with me? A lot of these judgments, I mean, in a sense, in our society, the gender inequality, in this limited context, I think it helps women. Because women at least look at these things cumulatively and think about how it defines them morally and ethically. Whereas a lot of men have this sick mentality that life is a competitive sport and that they're literally going to score a point by having sex with a stranger under those circumstances, which is, from my perspective, really sick and evil and bad and wrong. It's a really bad way to see the world. What do you think? The whole world is the opposing team in a sport that goes on forever until the day that you die? I think that is really sick and bad and evil and wrong. And yeah, I think almost at random, some of the concerns women have, like, hey, if I do this now, what does that say about the kind of person I am when I get out of this shower stall? What does that say about me for the rest of my life? I think that is some of the kind of awareness and conscientiousness and sense of responsibility for the consequence reaction that guys like Onision have to have. They have to be more sensitive to the consequences for who they are. And obviously in this case, with this girl who starts off 16 and ends up 18 years old, why can't you have some concern about the consequences for her for the rest of her life also? I knew someone who was a university professor, female university professor. And she admitted to me that she wanted to have sex with a male student, which is against the university's rules, probably illegal, probably there's a law somewhere. Now, the student was like 21 or older. This is a university context. This isn't a child, but there's an absolute question of, authority. There's a question of your moral obligations if you're a professor, so on and so forth. And I think, again, in terms of switching the genders, if it was a male professor and a much younger female student, people would right away feel a sense of apprehension, and people might be more inclined to make excuses when it's a female professor and a male student. And I just said to her straight up, look, this is evil. I'm going to tell you. No, if you do this, guess what kind of person you are? Then you are the kind of professor who will take your contract and flush it down the toilet for the sake of this kind of sexual tryst. You're someone who will violate your word, your oath of office, these commitments you've made, these higher ideals you say you believe in and serve. You'll violate all that so you can sleep with this 21-year-old guy. If you do this, that is who you are. Now, I just mentioned, I do not have a PhD. Technically, I'm still a university student. I have a BA at university. But I have served in the role of a university professor in China. I was hired to be a professor of English. Of course, there were female students, probably about 19 years old. Of course, there were female students, 19 or 20 years old, who wanted to sleep with me when I was a university professor. Okay? Now, there are many reasons why I would refuse. Many. Some of those reasons have to do with the consequences, for the young woman, for the girl. Some of them are more complex that I'm not really discussing in this video. Okay? But the most simple, most fundamental reason is the question of, who am I? Who do I want to be? Okay? Because if you do this, if you cross this line, forever, that is who you really are. I can't even say that your actions demonstrate your character. I can't say your actions reveal your character. I can't say your actions are a judgment on your character, because that still presumes this kind of bifurcation. Like there's a difference between the face and the mask. Like there's a difference between the judgment and your character itself, the reflection of your character itself. We're talking about one thing here. What you do is who you are.